I'm Andrea Packard, and I direct the List Gallery. During the academic year, the gallery is busy with talks, workshops, and distinguished visitors. Our most recent exhibition, Rackstraw Downs, A Wider View, featured 23 works by one of the world's foremost painters. It opened on March 5th, 2020, and was on view for just 1 week before closing to help mitigate the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. I had organized this mini survey to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the artist's first one person show, which took place at Swarthmore in 1969. We had scheduled a gallery tour by the distinguished curator, Storr. Since he couldn't discuss the exhibition in person, I invited him to speak with us online. I just want to thank you for joining me from a great distance and through the challenges of technology to talk about Rackstraw Downs.
Sure, absolutely.
I wondered what your thoughts are now as you have known his work so in depth in person and then also encountered it through reproductions. What do you notice when you compare his works in person to the experience of seeing them online?
Well, I think there is no comparison, and that's the case particularly of image painters and particularly of image painters that are striving for the kind of verisimilitude that he has, because there is no way that one can capture all the nuances of paint density, of color, of tone, and so on and so forth that he puts into them. And one of the biggest challenges that was posed by photorealism was that by taking photographs and painting them, they were denaturing the photograph. To re-photograph them then turns them back into what they are being removed from. Rackstraw most certainly is not a photorealist, but the level of resolution of his images is roughly comparable. And the kind of distance that one becomes aware of from the work of art, the discrepancy between the intensity of what you see in reproduction and the reality of it, in a sense, erases the art. The art is the double consciousness of a thing being a representation and that thing being, in fact, realistically speaking, a representation. In other words, in one case, you're thinking about the what of it, and the other case, you're thinking about the how of it. It's not as if you prefer the large thing to the reproduction, is that it is another thing totally. And you can get the image in a reproduction, you cannot get the work in the reproduction. And in his case, one of the things that he does is that he has pretty much diminished to the bare minimum all the things that go with painterly painting, and yet they are still there. They are still present. The little welts the paint forms, the brush drag on a stretched canvas, particular quality of the paint as it has been mixed and so on. And those things are not just pleasures added to the image, they are the image. And what one sees under those circumstances, or what one does not see in the case of a reproduction, is all important. So I am very much interested by his iconography. I'm very much interested by what he chooses to paint, but I'm mostly interested in it when he paints it, not because of that thing would have necessarily captivated me on its own.
Perhaps an excellent example of that is this view, which is on the screen now, fence at the periphery of a scrap metal yard. You mentioned the words double consciousness, and I think that's really evocative. Can you talk more about that and also the views that are condensed into his work and that have to be experienced over time?
Well, of course, the term double consciousness comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, and it refers to the sort of schizophrenia of being African American in this country. But there are many multiple kinds of double consciousness, and there's a tendency to try to homogenize consciousness in every domain, not only in racial politics. Now, for example, in the piece that you're showing me of the fence, the small segment means that I can take it in pretty comfortably just by letting my eyes run the distance from end to end of the image. In truth, if you were in a gallery like this, you would not see it that way at all. And your body is placed in some particularly active part of the painting, but the rest of what you see, you don't see in the same way that you would see if you treading off to the horizon, because it's flat, because it is not in depth. And therefore you're aware of your own movements in relation to the image. What I was going to talk about was the sort of strange correlation between this painting and Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. So it's a complex image. And again, in the most conversations about art, the categorical division of abstract and figurative is more trouble than it's worth, because the way in which you see is not based on what the image is, it's based on the conditions and physical scale of the thing you're looking at. And in his case, he's making paintings where the physical scale of what he's depicting is vastly bigger than we can take in a single glance under any circumstances in direct presence of it. But even the image is also bigger than we can take in one glance. And the distinction between conceptual and perceptual art falls apart when you deal with paintings like this, because they are conceived in order to be perceived. I think the Serra connection is not an inconsequential one. You know, if you ever saw Tilted Arc in place or any of Richard's big pieces, you have to get right up on top of it. And as you do, of course, you lose a sense of what the gestalt is. And it's important that the viewer remember or retain the idea that there is something going on in their own minds that is crucial to understanding what there is in front of their eyes. There's no such thing as naive vision. There is no such thing as simple perception. All perception require intellectual effort on the part of the artist and intellectual effort on the part of the viewer to decode and understand them. It's not entirely coincidental that Richard Serra and Rackstraw should have been thinking along the same lines. But if I make a comparison between Tilted Arc and other long serpentine or enveloping kinds of steel sculptures of Richard's and Rackstraw's Fence in New Jersey, it's not gratuitous. A lot of the thinking of the 70s didn't divide along the abstract figurative divide. It was fundamental thinking about the phenomenology of perception, and the essays of Maurice Merleau-Ponty were crucial in that, and the understanding that the viewer was an active constructor or a determinant of what was seen. And therefore, in the case of this piece, it's 10 feet roughly long. And if you look at it at a distance, you can in fact encompass the whole thing, but you aren't, because you miss all the details. If, on the other hand, you zero in on details, you lose the peripheral vision that gives it the sense of a whole. And that is a challenge to the viewer, because it means that the image, as you experience it, is the construct you make in your mind out of viewing it at different vantage points and over different durations. Now, that is exactly the set of terms that apply to Richard Serra's Tilted Arc and other long sculptures, is that there is no one view, there's no best view, there's no actual comprehensive view. Perceptual art, in the case of these two artists, and their work is highly perceptual. Richard's is tactile in ways that Rackstraw's is not, but Rackstraw's is tactical in ways that many people miss, because they think of it only in terms of verisimilitude, in terms of what it's a picture of and how accurate it might be. But if they look at the little nubbins of paint, that's like looking at the little rust spots on a Richard Serra piece. But the point is that it is an experience that you construct out of bits and pieces of information that are under your jurisdiction, not totally at the control of the artist. And that's a fundamentally more radical way of thinking about anything artistic that came into view in the 70s and was not there before. These are not Albert Bierstadts. These are not panoramic vistas of America and its grandeur. These are fact pictures spread out over vast areas, and the whole is there, but the experience of it is in the hands or in the eyes or actually in the mind of the viewer.
Certainly there's a quality to both their work that causes the viewer to be disoriented as we try to construct these narratives of what we're seeing and experiencing.
Well, certainly disorienting the viewer is a big part of what the artists of the 70s and beyond did. It is to say, do not take for granted what you see. What you see is something that you make in your mind. It's like looking at Chinese scrolls almost, but it isn't, because Chinese scrolls are most of them based on fade outs and ways in which the picture dissolves into space or into the liquidity of the mark or whatever it is. In this case, everything is drum tight from end to end, side to side. And that puts a particular demand on the viewer that nobody else does. A panorama of the traditional 19th century, 18th century variety, you stand in the middle and you look around it. There's one at the Metropolitan Museum where that's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to feel like you're in the middle of the scene of Paris. Rackstraw's paintings don't produce that effect because they aren't something that centers you in the middle of an illusion that is consistently intense on all sides. It's an illusion which is consistently intense over distance. And so you become hyper conscious of your own movements in relation to the work of art, or should. And in that sense, it's very close to what minimalism did, or at least some kinds of minimalism, because it's a radical redefinition of viewer participation.
Certainly, you have the experience in front of minimalist works and this work of becoming aware of what you can't see, of what is beyond your comprehension.
No, but it's also what you can see, but where you are the moving eye. You know, your eyes move, but then they're also stuck on this head that's on top of a body, and the body moves. It's kinetic. So these paintings are not static paintings in any sense of the word. Even if he wanted them to be, which I don't think he does, he couldn't make them static because the requirements of viewing makes the viewer active.
And it's interesting, when you said the word static, of course, I was thinking about how the world is becoming more static. We're confined to our apartments or homes, wherever we were when the pandemic hit, and the sense of understanding our movements is changing. We're having to understand travel and distance in different ways and imagine them differently. And so here we are looking at a photograph of a List Gallery installation of paintings that embody movement over time and ask us to venture forth and consider the landscape in ways that are very complicated. And so I'm going to try to do something which asks us to move through the space of the gallery and move back into time. One thing I love about exhibitions is that they collapse time in interesting ways and let us look at works like the Scrap Metal Yard picture right next to earlier works done decades earlier.
His earlier works are fantastic.
Yeah, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about his early works. In this view, the two on the left are from 1966, and the others are from the early 70s. One is Halldale from 1966, and the other's North Searsmont. I think you're familiar with the sense of touch in these pictures, and wondered what your thoughts were as you look at these.
Well, I think many things. First of all, this kind of topographic painting is a long tradition in English art. It is much less valued and not as deeply ingrained in American art. There are people like John Kane, who Rackstraw admires a great deal, who painted in Pittsburgh, who made the effectively topographical landscapes of the area around Pittsburgh. But by and large, American landscape painting is poetic, heroic, or whatever it is, but simply the description of the lay of the land is not what it's about. And I remember hearing Rackstraw say, and maybe even write one time, that he wanted a painting in which somebody who lived in that place could tell you exactly about what was going on in terms of the flora and the fauna and the crops and the whatever. He does that, but that's an attitude towards landscape which is a considerable distance from the ideas that most people have of what landscape is. And it also puts him in a position where he can pose the public basic questions that they don't ask themselves otherwise. If the landscape is supposed to be some sort of Garden of Eden, or if it's supposed to be some sort of manifest destiny, or whatever it's supposed to be, those are mythological constructs, right? The landscape is just the way things look and are, and they show in phases man's mark or humankind's mark on the earth. And many of those marks are ugly. The paintings can be beautiful, but the marks are ugly. Mm-hmm. And from very early on, Rackstraw painted Maine and other places as they were. It's significant that he paints something that a farmer could recognize and tell you a lot about what was in the picture if you asked the farmer. But the farmer is not the preferred audience for most art. I think in Rackstraw's case, it is the preferred audience, or at least the farmer and the taxi driver.
His own eye, of course, is central to that, and the synthetic quality of his own vision, which brings to it all the lessons learned from his upbringing in England after World War II, and the way the British landscape, of course, has been romanticized by so many masters, but Rackstraw was early on aware of the way that landscape is completely altered through history and industry. It isn't natural apart from human intervention, but something that has long since been transformed and continues to be transformed. So do you see that attitude in these pictures as well?
Absolutely. I think there was a very important British art historian named Klinger who wrote a book on the presence of the Industrial Revolution in the landscape. Because after all, Blake's statement about the dark satanic mills, those dark satanic mills were not in London. They were in the countryside, close to the resources. And that's the way early industry was done. You built your factory near waterways, near the mine from which you mined things, and so on. So the idea of a pure English landscape is a fiction. And it's a fiction that artists worked very hard to develop. But it is a fiction, and it's so the same is true in France. If you look at little Seurat paintings, you'll see chimneys in the background, or sometimes in other people, Pizarro and others. And one easily forgets that Pizarro and others were actually quite aware of social issues, quite aware of industrialization as a problem. They put those things in there, number one, because they were there, and number two, because they wanted people to think about them. They were no longer the landscapes of Claude or of the Barbizon painters. These were landscapes where human activity was altering natural beauty, and it could be painted in a beautiful way, but the clash was part of the substance of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
I think Rackstraw basically has brought that to this country. There were other people who painted industrial scenes, but they painted them as a kind of heroic statement about industry as a transformative function. But to do it, again, matter-of-factly, where there is no literature on either side, neither on the side of industry nor on the side of nature, it is how it looks, and then you begin the thinking process. A while back, you talked about his vision, right? I'm firmly of the belief that that which you cannot conceive of, you will not see. And one of the things that Rackstraw does very much is to create a conceptual framework in order that people perceive other things.
Yeah, so true. And the lack of melodrama, the empirical approach in these pictures is striking. And it's also striking the humility with which he approaches the landscape. And as he's left Yale, where he studied with Al Held and others, and so many of his peers were beginning to try to stake out a kind of artistic terrain for themselves, he didn't reach in these pictures for attention through scale or a kind of monumentality. And that humble approach, I think you see in some of his other works too. In this image here, we see some of his early cityscapes painted near where he lived in Upper Manhattan near Columbia. And on the right, you see 3 of the 5 early figure groups in portraits that we have in the show.
Well, those are the paintings that I'm most keen to see, and I hope that there'll be a chance to do that at his studio, or if the show can be extended at Swarthmore. But I would say, okay, the early figurative studies probably do have an element of humility. I would say the landscapes have none, because he made a very big gamble on a radical transformation of the way we think about landscape, and that is not humble. It really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very big ambition. And the thing was, he was able to sustain the effort. He was able to deliver the goods. And so I really think as a result of what Rackstraw did, landscape in this country will never seem to be the same art form. And if you think about an attribute of some of those early Maine landscapes, one of the artists in that world was Neil Welliver, who lived in Maine and who developed a kind of very delicious, buttery, decorative style for rendering vegetation and water and sky and so on and so forth. And a little bit of that is creeping into Rackstraw's paintings, and that's fine because it's a good way to do things. But in fact, his view is so much more strict and so much more demanding than Welliver's was. And so when you talk about ambition, these are small paintings. Neil Welliver's paintings were big. Neil Welliver's paintings were painterly in an obvious way. Rackstraw's were painterly in a terse way. But the ambition level is much bigger in these small paintings than in Welliver's work generally.
Interestingly, in these paintings from this early 70s, his touch is more contained. His gestures are a little bit smaller, and there's the beginning of that curved horizon that we see in so many of his panoramas.
Yeah. I mean, the arabesque or the curl or whatever you want to call it is a feature of a lot of landscape painting. You see it a lot in Canaletto, for example. So those kinds of calligraphic ways of dealing with describing things. The patterning and the sort of decorative aspect of Canaletto is not terribly different from what you would call the decorative aspect of Rackstraw's paintings, but Rackstraw's paintings don't try to be that. Canaletto was at a time when court painting, which his was there to please and delight. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Rackstraw's paintings is a kind of like, just look at it and just check it out, see what there is to see.
Yeah.
And if he puts those things in there, they are the most restrained indulgence in pure painterly activity, but they're not the reason that the painting exists. The painting exists to show you the things that are in it.
I have a few images to share with you of his early portraits. On the left, we have a portrait of Jay Hamlin, and on the right, Andre Hayoum, a friend of his who is an art historian. Are you familiar with these paintings? Have you seen them?
I've never seen them in the flesh. In fact, until I got the catalog the other day, I'd never seen them at all.
This is on the right, Hester and Christine rehearsing, and on the left, Steph reading A Nest of Ninnies to Rayana.
The woman on the bed reminds me a little bit of a Bonnard painting that Gertrude Stein Stone. They're echoes of traditions throughout these paintings, and that's fine. But it's important to remember, and I do remember because I'm that old, how very much this kind of realism was, even at that time, an anachronism. And looked old the day it was made, even if the paintings look fresh and lively and are, direct observational paintings. But the stylistics were conservative, deeply conservative. And the thing that Rackstraw did was he made a leap from a conservative idea of what realism could be. With his abstract paintings, he was up to the minute. When he started to make these other paintings, I don't know whether they were student paintings or what they were, but they were very much sort of on the approach ramp to contemporary art, but they were not on it. They were not on the highway. And the point is that once he started making landscapes, even those little ones in Maine, he was on the highway.
Yes, and it's interesting that actual highways, underpasses, and off ramps become frequent subjects for Rackstraw as he moved from Maine, settling in New York City, and began to explore. And increasingly, he painted vistas that reveal the infrastructure of transportation, and he turns to remote and forgotten sites. These are places in transition.
Absolutely. And I remember one thing he said about painting one of these paintings, that he was out there and he put his foot down and sort of pink dishwashing fluid sort of seeped up around his boots.
Huh.
He thought he didn't want to be there. It was like truly a toxic waste dump. But the idea of painting a scene like this and of not making it kind of beautiful in any way. There's beautiful brushwork, there's lovely light and so on. But this is America, and it's, this is the asshole of America.
It certainly is.
And the determination to paint that, and to paint it well and accurately and without editorially trying to sort of condemn it, but without making it prettier than it really is, that is a very radical move. And, true realism of the 19th century was a radical style. It was a rejection of all of the things in classical art that were made to make reality look more beautiful than it actually was. And some of that which we think about is particularly associated with the conventions that they chose, which were classical Greco-Roman conventions. But the basic impulse behind it was flawed as well, which is that you can't make reality more beautiful than it is without lying.
Yeah.
And realism is not about lying. As Lyndon Nachman once said, realism is about the absolute priority of the particular. And if you paint a landscape, the particular is everything having to do with what it really is. And here you can see Newark in the distance. You can see scum on the surface of the water. I think I can. This is the beautiful democratic vista, as it was at that time in this place.
This, of course, is a monumental in scope, but still retains that sense of the particular you were talking about, both in the title and as you look closely at all the innumerable details in the parking lot and the signage, everything.
One of the things I like about Rackstraw is You could do this another way. You could do it the way that Estes and a lot of the photorealists did, which is to sort of paint a period America, to paint an America which is already drenched in a kind of nostalgia. So when Estes paints a diner, it's not really that diner so much as the idea of the diner. What happened to Hopper's diner once it got into the 50s. Rackstraw is not interested in the literature of all of this. He's painting against it if he can, or if he must. And, this painting would be known to the people who live in this block, right? The waterway that you just showed me would be known to people who trudged in the mud around there or whatever, walked their dog, I don't know. But there's no attempt to make it something better than it is. And yet there is a respect for it as it is. And Linda Naucklin's remark about particulars is also about a kind of respect for things as they are. You don't need to improve them. You can't improve them. On the West Side Highway, recently they put up a storage facility for the, I forget what it is, it's for the salt that they put on the roads. And it's this angular building, the modernist building, and he paints that straight too. And that's actually a beautiful building, right? But the ability to paint this way, which is a period of architecture, but not painted as a period piece, and then to paint the other one, which is a new period in architecture, not to paint, but not to be painted as a period piece, and that both of them are functional buildings. They exist only for their function.
And the functionality of things is certainly a topic that has interested Rackstraw for more than 5 decades. How things work, what are the mechanisms by which we remain connected. This painting, which is just one right next to the ventilation tower painting, represents 2 ditches coming together in Texas, where he began to paint regularly in the 80s and onward. And this is from 1995. And this is just an amazing painting. I think it's hard to comprehend from a digital screen just how finely considered each inch of canvas is. Does that strike you in any particular way as different from the other works, or more of a continuation of what you were saying?
I think it's a continuation. It's also upping the ante in terms of, like in the Olympics, there's the thing you perform, but you're graded on how difficult the thing you choose is that you perform. So, there's the performance is one score, and the other score is for the degree of difficulty. And what Rackstraw has sort of done consistently is to increase the degree of difficulty. The way that the optical curve of these high tension lines is made, that's supremely artificial, right? Again, if you say he's a realist, yes, he's a realist, but he's a realist who takes liberties, because in order to get the view of the landscape that he wants, he also has to then bend the wires. And that is, rather than being done with a lens that does that for you, he has to calculate what those curves are. And that's very much an imposition of an idea onto a reality, but the purpose is to render that reality, not to render the idea as a tour de force.
And to me, it evokes the memory of one's own movement in space and the sense of how one has to move to comprehend a larger scene.
The part of Rackstraw that made Al Hell like paintings must have chuckled when he did this, because this is basically the return of the repressed, but it is not in the context of trying to abstract or jazz up painting. It is in the service of the larger proposition, which is to sort of play it straight, And all painting is artifice. All painting involves conventions. Perspective is not real; it's a construct, and therefore, why not try other perspectives? The Renaissance devised the one that we know best, but others are called for by other needs. And I think Rackstraw is basically kind of reinventing perspective, 3-point, 2-point, whatever you want, and then also allowing for the fact that visually speaking, these things make sense if they're locked into each other in a pictorial construct, even if they're inexplicable in terms of particular aspects.
And to illustrate your point a little bit, this detail of this painting shows an interweave of paint surface that can really only be achieved through standing there a long time, reflecting, reworking, and discovering the surface through that process of observation and response to both the scene and to the painted version of it.
Absolutely, but also the byproduct of the way he does it is it gives these high tension lines added flicker.
Yeah.
Because when a chunk of paint, if you want to call it, these are small chunks, but they're chunks, they're
Yeah.
physically present chunks, tries to qualify a line, and the line is in one color and the chunks are in another tone, and the two of them come together, they don't actually find a fine edge, the little irregularities. And if you look at a lot of hard edge painting, the same thing is true of that. If you look at Dutch, plasticist painting, it's very true of that. Mondrian's edges are all of them finely tuned in just the way that Rackstraw has finely tuned these edges, right? And as
Yeah.
somebody who makes paintings where this bedevils me enormously, I can only say hats off.
Wonderful. I wonder if you have time, we could turn to some of his interiors. There are two paintings in the show that he made at Snug Harbor, where he made numerous works, both of the Grand Hall, which you see here, and also the attics and basements and hidden spaces that reflect the way the building functions as a structure that people live and work in. I'm sure you're familiar with these and how strikingly different these two pictures are. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
Rackstraw is a modernist, okay? He's not a classic modernist, but he certainly knows what modernism is and why it was interesting. And so these are subjects that allow him to indulge in things relative to that problem. The long hallway is the anti-modernist thing par excellence. It's full of decoration. It's full of a plunging deep perspective. It's full of volumes and all the things that modernism forbade. The other one is full of dark passages where the construct of the verticals and horizontals and diagonals, particularly within the rectangle, is as taut as it can be. And this is like a man who has given up on doing abstraction, but finding ways in which either playing off of it or towards it, in the modernist definition of that, becomes the game. And all painters that I know who make paintings have multiple reasons for making them. And the chief one, and I have to say in many cases, is play. Huizinga, who was a wonderful Dutch historian of the Middle Ages, wrote a book called Homo Ludens. And Homo Ludens is the man who plays, the human being who plays. There's Homo Faber, who we know. There's Homo sapiens, we also know. One is about knowledge, one is about making. But the man who plays is also a major character in our character. And Rackstraw, for all of his sort of austerity of style, is a very playful man. And this is coming out in these paintings because it's a long game. Each one of these took weeks and weeks and weeks to make. But it comes from a kind of like an impish what if thing. What if I painted that long corridor, that long hallway? There'd be a lot of really interesting stuff to paint. I think maybe I'll do it. Yes. Okay, those very heavily carved door sills and lintels, that'll be fun to paint. And and the stuff underneath the rafters, that'd be fun to paint too.
And I'm so glad you mentioned play because in part it's the subject of his painting Presidio. As you can see, there are on the sandhills of this region, the calligraphy of lines left behind by kids who are using their ATVs to do wheelies and go up and down the hills.
RVs do essentially what people did in making the Nazca lines. They make a big picture on the ground, right? And Rackstraw is of the generation that created earth art. And Rackstraw is of the generation, therefore, of all the things like all the artists like Walter de Maria and others who made things that could not be seen, in a sense, that were invisible, except that you could see it if you were standing right above it, but you didn't see the whole construct. So again, I think there's an element of intellectual play, an element of art criticism. There's a lot of stuff embedded in this, and how consciously or unconsciously it plays into it, I don't know. But I see it there, and since we are pretty much of a generation, I'm pretty sure he does too, since he spends much longer with these things than I do.
And where Rackstraw is spending time now is in his own studio and loft space, which has been the subject of a number of paintings, including this one. Of course, many of us are confined to our home studios, offices, rather than in group situations. And that sense of emptiness or loneliness and but expectancy feels embodied here. We read this picture in a certain way now that perhaps is different from how we might have considered it before.
I hope so. I hope people rediscover the pleasures of just sitting someplace and watching what it is.
Well, he's no stranger to solitude, letting things unfold, finding interest in things that other people might walk by or disdain.
Yeah.
And so Rackstraw's sixth floor studio space is really quite nice. It's full of light, as this picture shows. It's got multiple sources of light, but it's also very simple and unassuming. It's not been made over. It's simple. And what really is important here are the books and the elements of painting and of course light itself.
Rackstraw is not into lifestyle lofts. He's into a loft as a place to be and to work,
Yeah.
which is what they were originally.
Of course, the loft space reflects his sense of place and his many accomplishments after working for more than 5 decades. But traveling back in time to 1969, when Rackstraw had his first show at Swarthmore, you were a student majoring in French. Can you recall what it was like encountering his artwork for the first time?
So I remember the exhibition very well. And since there was so little of that at Swarthmore at that time, I mean, Harriet Shore was sort of the representative of art on campus, and Hedley Reese was the other one. But Swarthmore was a campus that was pretty indifferent, if not sometimes openly hostile to the visual arts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's changed a lot at last.
Certainly you and others, despite that lack of early attention to the arts, managed to flourish and build foundations for your careers in art. And it's been interesting to see how your trajectory has intersected with Rackstraw's, and you've been a champion of his art. I was curious if you wanted to talk a little bit about how, as you were curating exhibitions by notable artists such as Robert Ryman or Gerhard Richter, how Rackstraw's work has continued to hold your attention.
Well, it's because the whole point is that his attention is fully invested in what he paints. So if you are looking for attention grabbing, but not just attention grabbing, but attention holding painting, he's kind of the definition of it in realism. And so that is one reason. Two, I never subscribed to any of the big theories about what needed to happen or what had happened in art as if they were deterministic. So I didn't see a conflict between being interested in Rackstraw Jones and being interested in Robert Ryman, for example. Ryman said famously that it's the how, there's never a problem with the image, it's the how of the painting that makes the image. And that is, I think, true to a very large extent. Now, I would not be as strict as he is in the sense that choosing a subject matter that is itself rich in meaning and content is another possible step. You don't have to take it, but if you do take it, it's significant that you have. But in any case, I think art is not so mysterious. I think it does not follow rules. I think that artists make up their own rules if they're any good. I think that the hard part is when a kind of settled conventional opinion applies, be it conservative or quote unquote radical. It's in nobody's best interests, and certainly not art in general. So that I like it when there are big extremes of activity going on simultaneously. I'll tell you a story, and this is, I don't know if I ever told this to Rackstraw, but I acquired a painting of his for the Modern. At the time I was sort of in my first years there, I put a reserve on a painting. And I waited and waited and waited because it was not inexpensive. And I just couldn't find a probable donor. And so I finally decided to throw myself on the mercy of the committee. Now, there was a woman who was the epitome of style named Lily Auchincloss, who was old New York society and who was elegant beyond elegant. She was known in our circles as the man who introduced Andy Warhol to Marcel Duchamp. She had those kinds of connections. And at this meeting, I was making my bid for Rackstraw's painting. And again, I had no money in my pocket and I needed some. And she just looked over at me. She said, "I'll buy it." And I thought, if the woman who introduced Andy Warhol to Marcel Duchamp, which is to say, the most advanced art of its time of a certain ilk, could see the merits in his work and would put hard money down on it, that is the way I think things should be. And fortunately, that's the way they work.
That's a great story. And I guess it points to the way, in a sense, the paradox of his work, that it seems to be something we should know already about. People can try to paint this way, but if you start to do that, you'll soon realize how incredibly hard it is to marshal so much information, to have that mastery of proportion.
He's a supremely self-disciplined artist. And there's a phrase that comes up a lot in the criticism of minimalist art, and I think it has its origin with Solowit, or if not Solowit, somebody like Solowit, and they talk about the important things to make things visible.
Mhm.
Now, what artists do is they make things visible. You wouldn't see these things in reality if you hadn't had them drawn to your attention by someone. And the minimalists, by and large, did that by marking and framing. Rackstraw does them by, representational means. And, if you think of what he does as rendering, which it is, rendering is to deliver to somebody something, right? To offer, but mostly to deliver it, to render unto them this thing. And I think what Rackstraw does is he makes things visible, and his technique of rendering is also a kind of gift economy gesture to people who don't know that it's there and wouldn't look for it unless indicated.
Yeah.
But he does that, and I think it's fantastic.
That reminds me of a story Rackstraw told me about coming to Swarthmore. And this is not a picture of that, of course. It comes from the book that you created, that
Yes.
beautiful monograph about Rackstraw. And I love this picture. And it reminded me of how Rackstraw said when he did come to Swarthmore, he told the art students they shouldn't just paint landscapes. They should first go dig up the crumb woods or the meadow and plant their own vegetables, and thereby immerse themselves in the place and understand it more fully. And then their paintings would embody that knowledge. I love this picture because, of course, it makes you imagine his early days when he was still sorting things out and patiently embarking on new directions, and also how he was, before so many others, gardening and growing his own vegetables and thinking environmentally and holistically in a way we still need to learn.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the Red Groom's film of a party? It's a Rudy Burkhardt film of a party at Red Groom's house, and in the middle of it, Rackstraw starts to dance, and he was a wild man. So when you see this very self-possessed, stern-looking fellow, just know that there's a crazy man inside. Only somebody crazy would do what he has done.
I think we can hardly imagine something more interesting to go look up and Google. Before we do that, I wondered if you have any closing thoughts or additional remarks you wanted to make.
Well, I'm surprised this show was not done at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I'm surprised that this show wasn't done at any number of other big museums. It's great that Swarthmore is doing this. It's a show I'm still hoping to see, but actually Rackstraw is big time. He deserves big time museum attention, and I hope he gets it.
Well, and I do too, and I hope perhaps we can be planting that seed. And there's so many other aspects of his work that could be brought forward with more space.
Absolutely. You'll have bragging rights when that happens.
Well, we thank you for your time and insights, and I do hope that we can bring you down to Swarthmore again soon when the pandemic eases up. And I wish you good health. Of course, I know we both wish Rackstraw and everybody else good health as they watch this.
Well, I'm going to give him a call now saying you've just done this,
Great.
and I'm very happy.
Well, again, many thanks, and
Sure.
hope we'll be in touch.